But since this war began, children, as well as adults, have been victims of Russian aggression. At least 5 children were killed in the attack on the train station. At least 169 children have been killed since the war began. President Zelensky posted on Instagram after the attack on the train station, quote, "Lacking the courage to stand up to us in the battlefield, they are cynically destroying the civilian population. This is an evil that has no limits, and if it's not punished, it will never stop," end quote. Dmytro Kuleba, foreign minister to Ukraine, tweeted, quote, "This was a deliberate slaughter. We will bring each war criminal to justice," end quote. People aren't the only ones suffering during this war. Most of the surviving animals at Feldman Eco Park in Kharkiv had to be euthanized when their enclosures were no longer stable enough to keep the animals enclosed. Lions, tigers, and other large animals were in danger of escaping when the decision was made to euthanize them before they could escape. As many as 100 animals didn't survive the shelling by the Russians. Some of those that did survive the shelling starved to death as food supplies ran low. Feldman made a desperate plea to help the animals on Facebook. Quote, "I am often asked what happened to the park. Today, we are going to tell Kharkiv residents that the park is no longer there. After yesterday's fired missiles, enclosures were destroyed. All infrastructure is destroyed. But miraculously, tigers and lions remained alive. Their cages were very badly damaged. They can get out at any moment. And the enclosures are in serious condition where the bears are. Today, the decision is made. We have until the evening, or we must kill all of the animals, euthanize them, or accept an offer of their transportation. But there is no chance, no ideas, no redirecting them now. If any idea is found, maybe we can save some little jaguars or panthers, but all adult animals are likely to be destroyed," end quote. A few days later, a worker from the Feldman Zoo had driven some rare tapirs to safety. He came back and rescued several kangaroos. He used his own personal van to transport the animals. 3 staff members have been killed while trying to tend to the remaining animals. An animal shelter in Kyiv was bombed early in the fighting. Over 100 dogs and cats died along with all the caretakers at the shelter. Almost a month later, Ukrainian soldiers found the last 30 or so surviving animals under the rubble that had once been their shelters. Those animals were taken to the Polish border where they weren't allowed to leave Ukraine, but are now being cared for by volunteers. In the middle of all of this is Volodymyr Zelensky. Zelensky was born to Jewish parents in the central Ukrainian city of Kryvyi Rih. When he was born, this area was under Soviet rule. 3 of his grandfather's brothers were killed by Nazi occupiers. His grandfather survived World War II. When Zelensky decided to go into politics, he had no prior experience. He had graduated from law school, but he had turned to a career in the entertainment industry. He was a comedian. His promise to end corruption in Ukraine and come to an agreement in the Donbass got him elected. He often said, quote, "You don't need experience to be president. You just need to be a decent human being," end quote. Orysia Lutovich, who is a research fellow at the London think tank Chatham House, said, quote, "He is quite empathetic as a person. He finds good connections with people," end quote. Empathy is something that would normally get politicians chewed up and spit out, but empathy has become Zelensky's strongest positive trait. A few months before Russia invaded Ukraine, Ukrainians saw Zelensky as another failed leader. In January of 2022, Mary Louise Kelly of NPR went to Ukraine to interview Ukrainian citizens at a skating rink that Zelensky had contracted to be built in front of his office. Daniel Estrin of NPR summed up the interviews with the people of Ukraine perfectly. He said, well, if you look at this poll from last week, over half of Ukrainians polled think Zelensky would not be able to protect Ukraine in case of a full-scale Russian invasion, end quote. He went on to say that he had spoken with Oleksiy Haran, who runs a think tank. Haran had had a very long day talking with foreign embassies about this whole situation. Haran said, quote, listen, Ukraine is a democracy. It's an imperfect democracy, but it is a democracy. This is not Russia. You can hear people criticizing the president in the streets, even at the skating rink. There are vocal opposition parties here, and yet everyone realizes that Russia wants to take advantage of Zelensky's lower approval ratings right now to weaken him with this threat of invasion. Russia's goal is to weaken Ukraine's leadership. So right now, a lot of critics of Zelensky are saying with Russian troops at the borders, it is not the right time to call Zelensky to resign, end quote. After February 24th, Zelensky's popularity rating went to 90%. He's even managed to bring U.S. leaders together. Both Republicans and Democrats praise his bravery and his integrity. Texas Republican Representative August Pfluger called Zelensky a lion of a leader and said that he's showing bold courage in the face of evil. Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff said that Zelensky has demonstrated incredible bravery. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham joined Schiff in demanding that Russia be removed from SWIFT, the network that connects banking institutions around the world. Graham stated in a tweet, quote, when it comes to sanctions against Putin, if we are not doing everything possible, we are not doing enough. Time is not on our side, end quote. Before this war, Zelensky was negotiating for peace in the Donbass. Russia continued to build forces along the Russian-Ukrainian border. Zelensky felt that an invasion of Ukraine was inevitable and issued a plea via television to stop the impending war. His pleas fell on deaf ears. In the early morning hours of February 24th, Russian cruise missiles began to fall on Ukraine. Putin had never declared war on Ukraine. He told Ukrainians and Belarusians that this was a special military operation. Hundreds of civilians and military personnel were killed on the first day of fighting. They were not completely prepared. They knew it was coming, but they didn't know when or how, since Russia had forces everywhere. Russia's army poured into Ukraine, Crimea, and Belarus, and Zelensky took to the airwaves again, this time to ask for help from the West. He asked for military aid, including a no-fly zone. And while the West originally responded with sanctions against Russia, they refused the no-fly zone on grounds that it may start a bigger war. Yulia McGuffey, editor-in-chief of the Novaya Vremya news website, said that Ukrainians have favorably accepted their president since the Russian invasion. Quote, full support and respect came, I think, after Russia started its war. All Ukrainians have closed ranks around Zelensky. He is playing a uniting and, I would say, inspiring role, partly by his own example. He is leading a government that is repelling Putin's army, and for that, many sincerely admire and respect him, end quote. Zelensky has become the face of Russian resistance. He's used media to his advantage. He's stayed and rallied his people. When the Russian media tried to claim that he had fled Ukraine, he countered by filming himself in the streets of Kyiv. When the U.S. offered to evacuate him out, he said, quote, the fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride, end quote. He's seen on Ukrainian media outlets every day. He still asks for aid from the West to help fight the war. Aid has come in the form of anti-tank weapons and surface-to-air missile systems. The Ukrainian people have rallied and at times seem to be holding their own in the face of a much bigger opponent. Worldwide, Zelensky is seen as a hero. He's rallied his people. He's stayed in the fight. As a Ukrainian, he has as much to lose as his citizens. He's accused the Russians of war crimes and genocide, and he's shown through media that these accusations are true. After the Russian army pulled out of Kyiv, Zelensky walked the streets to assess the damage. 60 Minutes was on hand. The cameras rolled as Zelensky walked through the streets. He came upon a neighborhood where the fighting was most intense. In the streets of that neighborhood, several civilians lie dead. Some of the victims had their hands tied behind their backs. In that moment, Zelensky's face crumbled. It was the first time that he had shown any intense emotion on camera. His face showed a mixture of grief and anger. His people had suffered at the hands of Russian soldiers. Zelensky is an actor, yes, but the emotion that was portrayed on his face was not fake. He was generally heartbroken and enraged. But there was something else I saw. I saw guilt. I saw him take some form of responsibility for what had happened in that neighborhood. I could hear his thoughts. Could I have done more to stop this? Is there another solution that I'm not seeing? Since this war started, Zelensky has proven himself to be a brave leader. He's stayed with his people. He's gone to the airwaves to rally for assistance, and he's gotten as much as NATO and the EU will allow. He's gotten arms and anti-tank missiles and ground-air missiles, but he's also gotten people. People have come from all over the world to volunteer themselves not only in military operations, but also in humanitarian efforts. Putin is hell-bent on starting another war. He wants a world war. He wants the world to fear Russia. That war began in Ukraine. There are several ways that this war could end. Putin's death could bring an abrupt end to it, but who knows what other megalomaniac is waiting in the wings to take his place. Ukraine could fall, but would that stop Russia from invading other countries? Probably not. Ukraine is only the beginning. Other countries in the region are lining up to join NATO and the EU as quickly as the paperwork can be processed so that they will have military backing of Western countries if Ukraine falls. Putin won't stop at Ukraine. These countries know it. Another scenario is that the West formally goes to war with Russia. This would be World War III. Putin is threatening to use nuclear weapons if his demands aren't met and there is any further Western interference. But after watching him invade Ukraine with no warning, do we trust that he won't use nuclear or chemical warfare without warning? It's 100 seconds to midnight, and the world is watching as crimes against humanity are being committed against the people of Ukraine. I'd like to thank my friend L. Long for giving me some great background on Russia and the surrounding countries, sharing some thoughts with me, and giving me resources so that I could do valid research. In the final episode, I'll be talking with my friend Lisa Smith about her experiences doing humanitarian work in Poland and Ukraine. Please join us to hear Lisa's experiences firsthand. Please see the show notes for references and other information on the podcast and ways that you can help Ukrainian refugees and their families. And as always, thank you for listening to Cause of Death, 100 Seconds to Midnight.